Hi, everybody. It's Dr. Carlton E. Green. I am the Director of Diversity Training and Education here in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion at the University of Maryland. Today, I am privileged to be in conversation with one of my colleagues from across campus, Dr. Tita Chico, who is a professor of English, of course, in the English department, but she's also the faculty director for the Center for Literary and Comparative Studies. Tita, do you want to come on and tell us a little bit more about yourself before we begin this conversation?
Thank you, Carlton. It's such a pleasure to be here and to be in conversation with you. And I also want to say that and to everyone listening to this, that I have the utmost respect and appreciation for what Dr. Green has done for our campus and our communities more generally. Just I've in kind of being in different webinars with you, it's been profoundly helpful. So thank you for that. I'm a professor of English, which means I'm tenured. I'm a full professor. I have been a scholar and teacher of 18th century British literature for 25 years, more than 25 years. And I am deeply committed to the ideals and to reckoning with the shortfalls of the university as a civic institution.
Mm.
And given all of that, I've had a number of administrative roles, and I started last summer, a year ago, as Carlton said, as faculty director for the Center for Literary and Comparative Studies in the English department.
Great. Thank you so much. The reason why I wanted to have this conversation with you was because last academic year, the center, under your leadership, sponsored an anti-racism series that has really produced quite a voluminous amount of information. There are a number of videos, there is some writing that's coming out of that. And so, given that we are still in a time where anti racism is going to be an important component of university life for our students, faculty, and staff. Knowing that we're going to be having students come back to the campus, faculty and staff re-enter into the campus, and these will be topics that many of us will still be wrestling with, even if we think about everything that's happened from COVID to January the 6th to the ongoing killings to what's happening at the border. Like, there's still so many things that are occurring around us that are still relevant to our lives. So I thought it might be important, actually, to make sure that we introduce the broader campus community to the series that you all have sponsored, as well as some of the literature that's coming out of that, because it could be really useful. So with that being said, why don't you tell us a little bit about the series that you sponsored last year and how you came to that as an idea?
Thank you. So the series is, it's 22 different talks and presentations and symposia with over 60 speakers from mostly the United States, but also Britain and the Caribbean. And this is a series that really takes the idea of anti-racism as an intellectual object of inquiry, which is to say, what happens when your research question begins with anti-racism? And what happens when your teaching begins with anti-racism and works out from there? So to center this as an intellectual concept with a history and a politics and aesthetics, it simultaneously is a practice. So what happens and how do you make anti-racism not just something you study and discuss, but something that informs how you do your work, which means who's involved, how value is conveyed, how resources are allocated. So anti-racism becomes both a theory and a praxis. And that gets, and the multiplicity of, and the contradictions within anti-racist theory and praxis really is borne out in the work that as a collective
Mm-hmm.
that we accomplished this past year. And one of the things that we wanted to do was to have a video archive of all of the talks. So everyone here is welcome, very welcome to encourage to take a look and poke around and view things that you think might be of interest, which might kind of cascade into something else. But this all really came about, obviously last summer was a heightened moment in a long history, but a very heightened moment of racial injustice in our country.
Mhm.
And so and that was it coincided with when I took over as faculty director of the center. And there were really, it seemed to me there were two options given given the urgency and the national visibility and international visibility of Black Lives Matter in
Mm.
the midst of a global pandemic. There
Mhm.
were two options. One, we just all lay low and try to do our work. Or two, and this is where I really wanted to use the resources that I have available as a full professor in the
Mm.
time and space to go big and to really think ambitiously. What does it mean for an English department, beginning with an English department, to to really stand behind, to do something besides just say we are in solidarity with Black Lives Matter?
Mhm.
And that as scholars who study words, we know that words absolutely matter. And
Mhm.
words are about action. Words
Mhm.
are fundamentally about action, about creating the realities that we think really need to exist. So
Mhm.
that was what prompted, and that's really what this series is taken together.
Thank you for sharing that. You were mentioning so like the history, the politics, the aesthetics. So it's really trying to take a maybe a wholesome look, right? A really broad look at how it is that we can not only think about this anti-racism, but I solely appreciate this piece around praxis. Like, what are we doing with all of this thinking that we're coming up with? I think that probably is something that resonates throughout the work that I have seen while watching the videos and reading some of the literature that we'll talk about here in just a second. That seems to be what people are trying to get at. And maybe I should just say, reading one of the essays, I was really struck by one of the authors saying that, there is this theory, right? And then there's practice, which is a whole other story that can be harder to tell. And there are ways that institutions of higher education, or just institutions more broadly, can benefit from all this theorizing, from all this writing, from all of this scholarship, without actually centering and protecting the lives of those who are most at risk or in danger as a result of racism. So this theorizing, this practice becomes a whole other thing, right? Before we go into talking about the practice, though, I wonder, and you kind of mentioned this too about the who gets involved. Can you talk a little bit about the who, and how you came to decide who would be involved or who would be featured as speakers in your series?
And thanks for that question, because it goes to this idea of practice, right? So whose work, we have limited time, we have limited money.
Mhm.
Whose work will we center, and whose work will we hold up and give space to? And so the principles were to invite more junior colleagues,
Mhm.
and by junior I mean beginning assistant professors,
Mhm.
postdoctoral students,
Mhm.
um, um, sorry,
Mhm.
postdoctoral kind of postgraduates. And the reason is also, another piece of this is that higher education is on fire,
Mhm.
and that there is the career trajectory of PhDs is very fraught. So this is a time to use the resources that we have to imagine and make space for the intellectual work of people kind of coming up now. And so as I view myself as a steward, that I am a steward of the center, and in that way, the programming really emerges from a very collaborative, very hands-on effort of seeking potential speakers, of
Mhm.
seeking them out through recommendations, through networks, and making, crafting invitations that uphold both the kind of intellectual vibrancy, but also the practical um, requirements that this is a generative and this is a
Mhm.
welcoming space,
Mhm.
and that we hope to develop multiple dialogues. And part of what this is pushing against is the idea um, of having one talk and you're finished.
Mhm.
And if we talk about race and racism and the lived experience once in a year, then check mark, we're done, we're done.
Mhm.
That this is a problem and a situation that affects everyone. So
Mhm.
it's a kind of process, and I say this to my colleagues, my more established colleagues. This is the work of cultivating networks and cultivating trust and doing lots of homework and reading far outside my field. I work on 18th century British literature,
Mhm.
and anti-racism is fundamentally central to the field in a way that the field doesn't can barely acknowledge.
Mhm.
So it's a responsibility of everyone in the community to make these spaces possible. So I'm very lucky. There's a lot of conversations that happen, and also always sometimes it's not the right time or the right space for someone. And I have a little list. I'll circle back. I'll circle back.
Right.
Maybe it's a time that will work.
Right. I really, really am drawn to your comment about being a steward over this center, right? And in some ways, a steward of this program, a steward of this effort that you've pulled together. I think that, as I'm listening to you, one of the really practical things that it sounds like people could take away from this is that when you begin this work, thinking about who is involved is key. And it's also really key to think about whose voices will be placed at the center of the conversation, whose talent will be placed at the center of the conversation, whose labor will actually be involved in the conversation. And in this context, it sounds like thinking in terms of how do we teach about this. We went to, or you went to, junior faculty members or early career faculty members, thinking in terms of doctoral postdoctoral fellows, right, who could be involved in the conversation. And I also know that at one point, I think you had some students actually involved in the conversation too. So really thinking about who are the folks that may not necessarily sit in the center of the conversation all the time. Who are the folks who may not necessarily have all of the institutional power invested in them or who may not have the roles? How is it that we reach out to what could traditionally be seen as the margins and bring those people in,
Yeah.
right?
And I think that's my responsibility. And when I say my, I mean I really think I have um, it's a collective responsibility that those margins are actually the center if for a future, and that we're at a moment, we're kind of at one of those decision tree moments, and how are we going to proceed? And I think the university will be stronger, much stronger, by not having those voices at the margin, but having them absolutely at the center, and
Mhm.
then developing the intellectual and the policy work that comes out of that. I think
Mhm.
absolutely.
Yes, yes. So I actually want to flip the questions a little bit. I was going to ask you something, but I want to go to the scholarship that's coming out of this. Because that is still about the voices. It's still about the people who you invited into this whole effort. Can you talk to us about how it is that can you talk to us about this literary effort that you all are undertaking?
Sure. So one of my skills and experiences as as a full professor is I really understand publications and I really understand research. And as uh, these conversations were happening, I knew that we wanted the video archive. I wanted to kind of have a record of this, but I also thought, wait a second, there's so much in this collective. Um, and so I sent a note. I said, is anyone interested in pursuing a publication possibility?
Hmm.
And and I really wanted, in a sense, to make that possible. And there was a lot of enthusiasm. And the other piece of this is that I wanted to make this part and kind of speak to the third facet of the programming, which I haven't mentioned yet, but is this idea of public engagement
Hmm.
and the idea of public facing humanities. And so I approached a senior editor at the Los Angeles Review of Books and pitched the idea. And in pitching the idea was a symposium that really emerged from these conversations. And so from that, this is part of the tenure requirements for earlier career scholars coming in. It's part in increasing. It is now a kind of standard requirement that we have what's called public facing scholarship. So the idea that together various authors and various guests could write pieces, or we have these, so we have standalone single essays and then conversations. It allows, it's a, in a sense, it's a line on the CV, but it also is part of a larger conversation in which these speakers are in this space together. So the Los Angeles Review of Books is calling it a symposium because it's unfolding over 6 weeks. And this is the first is 12 shorter essays and then 5 conversations. So it's about 25 people from the series who are publishing this summer.
Mm-hmm. Great. And it probably stands to also acknowledge that you wrote an intro for the series. And I encourage people to check out the intro because I think that what it does is really tries to do the work of anti-racism in really acknowledging the University of Maryland's very complicated history with race and with racism, and documenting in a very public way um, some of the um, some of the pieces that are harder for us to talk about, right? How it is that we are on the land that was stolen from the Piscataway people. How it is that we have founders or ancestors of the institution who were enslavers. How it is that the murder of Lieutenant Richard Collins III is also in some ways connected to the series. And I think I read there that the series is actually dedicated to Lieutenant Richard Collins III. So I would encourage people to check out the intro as well, because I think that it gives you something to think about even as you dive into the rest of the series. Um, what I want to ask you about here is about practice, right? About praxis. Can you talk to me at all about how you were changed? Or are there things that you took away from, maybe those are two different questions. Can you talk about maybe 2 or 3 things that you're taking away from this that might apply to your practice as a professor, as a public intellectual, as an administrator? Are there things that you took away from this work or from these conversations or from this literature that now informs your practice differently?
Absolutely. There's several things, and I kind of use myself as a case study for colleagues to think about. And one is, it was in our first program, and it was about pedagogy. And this was a piece of wisdom from a graduate student at a Canadian university, McMaster University. And she said that what gets so muddled and what gets so confused is the difference for her white students, her difference between the difference between discomfort and
Mm,
harm. And that, I have to say, I'm a white Latina, and I, in hearing her words and then hearing others really see this as a very illuminating distinction and moment, that that is something that I have held very dearly.
mhm,
And that in moments, this work is very hard. This work is very hard. And in moments of my own discomfort, working to be very attentive to what's the risk? What's the
mhm,
risk for me? Is it being uncomfortable?
mhm,
And I think particularly for white students talking about racism, it can certainly be very uncomfortable, but it doesn't harm them in the way that it can harm a Black student or an
mhm,
Indigenous student. A
mhm.
discomfort and harm, they get confused. Uh, White people take discomfort as harm, and it's not.
Mhm. Thank you for sharing that. I told you earlier that I'm working on a piece that I have to present at a conference. That's actually one of the things that I was really contemplating as I was thinking about this conversation. And it really came from the work of Dr. D.L. Stewart, who was a student affairs practitioner who has written some things, of course, as a scholar in their own right, but also has published in some of the popular blogs or like Inside Higher Ed. And they make this really important point that when we try and promote comfort and safety and we get them all really confused and we forget about harm, what we're actually doing is ignoring the histories of harm, the policies, the practices that have historically and even contemporaneously affect the lives of our students of color in the classroom. And we're not asking ourselves the question of safety for whom, right? Because if white supremacy or racism or anti blackness is present, it means that students of color are not going to be safe, period, right? And so we really have to interrogate that and ask some serious questions about that. And as practitioners, be willing to get into that conversation with white students and not just let it go by. Because in some ways, we can all, if a student tells us that they feel uncomfortable, that they feel unsafe, there's a way that we might default to thinking about, oh, I need to make this safer for the student, right? But that actually probably needs to be challenged a little bit, or we need to begin to think about that and interrogate that a little bit more, is what I'm getting from you.
I think so. And I think that one of the kind of that is a shift in language for myself, and I don't have research to kind of to point people to, but to think about, I mean, I understand the language absolutely of a safe space, but
Mm-hmm.
it raises the problems that you're talking about. And so particularly in issuing invitations and in setting up all of the technology to, because this is all on the internet, right? And is to think of this as creating an ethical space,
Mm-hmm.
and that is and that allows and actually requires discomfort,
Mm-hmm.
and that is the space often, not always, but often discomfort is the space of learning.
Mm-hmm. It's what I say to people all the time in training, all the time, right? But I really appreciate you phrasing it as so like, and it's ethical work, right? We have to be much more ethical in thinking about these requests for safety or for comfort, right? I appreciate you naming that. What else? Anything else that you want to name that you learned from the series?
I'd say there are two other things that I wanted to share, and one is, um, and I mentioned my field, so 18th century British literature, really what, but 18th century Britain is the time of, saltwater slavery, and that's the phrase from Stephanie Smallwood, of the British Empire building on the backs of dehumanizing enslaved Africans into commodities. So that is to say that Black Lives Matter, which last summer was on everyone's television and in everyone's newspaper, is never divorced from any teaching or subject area. It is one of the talks that we had. The second talk that we sponsored was about Shakespeare.
Mm,
And Shakespeare is an icon of British literature. We have the Folger Shakespeare Library that's tucked right behind the Capitol. And Shakespeare, when studied and discussed by two Black men, scholars we invited, is an intellectual project that for themselves cannot be separated from their lives as Black men. So
hmm.
they walk into a classroom and white students say, why are you teaching Shakespeare and why are you not
Oh,
teaching
wow.
American literature? So
Wow.
that is to say that Black Lives Matter can never be separated from any object of study. And this is about engineering, and this is about philosophy and public health and arts and chemistry, that it is never separate. And because of that, it is also never separate. It can never be divorced from any facet of the university, whether that's curriculum or policy or parking or how you get in and out of a building when it's nighttime, the security. So
Yeah.
that's the second thing that I would really say.
I think that, I so appreciate you naming that because I think that there's a piece of this that really, even though people would like to say that race doesn't matter to certain things, what it really lifts up or amplifies is that everything is racialized, right? There is no way for us to avoid thinking or talking about or observing the racialized aspects of our lived human experiences. And even though, right, students, even, even right now in our current political climate, we see folks going to their school boards and saying things like, race doesn't matter, we're good people, we don't see this. Even in that, right, those are really racialized comments. And so to think about a professor, a black professor showing up to a course and students either implicitly or explicitly challenging his credentials, his presence, his capacity to be able to teach Shakespeare, right, shows how racialized our world is, and we would really like to avoid that. Yeah. What about your third thing?
So my third thing, and it specifically comes from a guest of ours who is a colleague of one of my colleagues in the English department, Cecilia Shelton, and Dr. Tempatious McCoy at Bowie State um, talks about, this is, she also writes about this in her LARB piece. She says, this is her phrase, check your circle for Black women. And so what does that mean? And she goes on and explains with great kind of generosity what that means. And she's not making the argument that all Black women are anti-racist, but she's making the argument that that is the place, that kind of intersectional place of colleagues is the place where we should begin. And then she offers in her written piece, she offers three sets of questions that I'd like to read for you. And the first one is, how many Black women are in your department?
Mm-hmm.
How many Black women are in your department that are not teaching curriculum that is based around their Black identity?
Mm-hmm.
The second question, how many of the Black women in your department serve across committees? Third, and this I really want to underscore for my colleagues who are not faculty of color, how many times have you heard the ideas and concerns of a Black woman be dismissed at a faculty meeting only for you to back channel and tell them you support them? And that last point, I think, is extremely important for my colleagues and I always to practice,
Mm-hmm.
which is when there is something in the moment in a department meeting that what would the verb that questions and devalues the contributions of a colleague, the time to redress that is not afterwards in a private conversation in which you say, the person apologizing saying, I feel so bad, I'm sorry. The time to take that up is in the collective sphere,
Mm-hmm.
and to say, no, I want to hear that again.
Mm-hmm.
Let's hear that again.
Mm-hmm.
This is what she said.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a moment, and that's what I mean by that's an ethical space.
Mm-hmm.
And so the easy way out to feel like you're a good person, we all want to feel like we're good people. I really understand that.
Yeah.
But it compounds the injury to then back channel,
Mm-hmm.
because then it is only that individual's responsibility, when at the beginning of the day, the middle of the day, and the end of the day, it is a collective responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the last bit of praxis that I wanted to share.
Really powerful. And interestingly, that's I was reading Dr. Tempatious's article earlier today, primarily because of the title, because I agree with her. I think that, and I talk about this when I do conversations with graduate students or when I'm talking to supervisors in psychology or other psychologists, that it becomes important to think about how we are valuing Black women in the context of our educational spaces. The essay really points out, I mean, I think she does a fabulous job of just saying, because of their intersectional identities, because of their intersectional experiences, because of having to live with the oppression of being Black and woman, many Black women have a lens for doing the critical conscious work of being able to analyze systems and come up with tools for being able to resist, right? It's not to say that all Black women, but it's highly likely that many will. And what I hear you saying, Dr. Chico, is that what this requires is for white folks who would ordinarily remain silent to break the silence. That her article really points out that it does a black woman no good for you to back channel her and not really amplify her concerns, her needs, her observations, her resistance. Right? It does her no good if you're going to send her a private message when in fact the system, the meeting, is continuing to take something away from her or continuing to abuse her or terrorize her in some type of way, right? And so we need our white colleagues, we need our men colleagues, right, even including our black men colleagues, to step into the space to say, hold, let's pause for a second. I think this person just shared something that was really important that we need to take up and consider. Right. Yeah. So we have to exercise more courage in that way. So I appreciate you pointing that out. Um, is there anything else that you would like to share about the series before we wrap up our conversation?
Well, it's personally, it's been a tremendous honor. And I think that the the virtual quality of this has enabled us in a moment of utter utter misery in so many ways, but to connect with a vast number of communities beyond the English department. And so across campus, but also off campus. And so what I want to say is that we're using this potential to begin planning a second year, anti-racism, and our focus will be communities and collaborations.
Mm,
And to that end, I'm very delighted to be in the position of collaborating with you and your office. We
mm,
are collaborating also to bring a creative writer. We're collaborating with the Prince George's County Memorial Library System. I think in a fundamental way, the English department needs to be with the public library. We need to
mhm,
really make those connections visible. And we also have another collaboration that we're almost finished planning with the Phillips Collection.
mm,
And that builds on the partnership between the University of Maryland and the Phillips. But it also speaks to, the long-standing whiteness of art museums,
yes.
and their diversity officer, McCabe Clay, is visionary and rigorous in really thinking about how the collection the museum can find its way forward. And University of Maryland has the same responsibility. So we're really thinking about, as we return to campus, whatever that means.
Mm,
It's not normal,
right.
and how can we bring what we've done last year to feed and strengthen what our community is. And I'm using the language of the Mellon Foundation, what a just community is
Mm,
in the years ahead.
mm. Thank you for sharing that. So, folks should look out for work coming up on this new series. And what's the theme going to be this year, Dr. Chico?
It's anti-racism, communities, and collaborations.
Right, there you go. And just to underscore, I think the first in the series will be on September the 9th. From 12 to 1, we will be co hosting or co sponsoring a conversation that will feature Dr. Annalise Singh, who is a counseling psychologist and the Chief Diversity Officer at Tulane University, and the author of the Racial Healing workbook. And so she's a scholar that I've invited, and Dr. Chico, you have invited.
Dr. Caritha Mitchell, she's a full professor of English at Ohio State University. She just published her second book called From Slave Cabins to the White House. And she is also a University of Maryland PhD, class of 2005.
And they'll be in conversation speaking specifically about racial trauma in the classroom, really trying to understand what it is, what it looks like, how it affects students, maybe even how it affects faculty of color who are teaching in that space, and what it is that we can all do when it comes to mitigating the harm that Dr. Chico was referring to earlier, how it is that we really assist in trying to mitigate and eliminate the harm that racism can cause in the classroom for our students. The last thing that I'll say, in addition to just thank you, is that I think a really important practical lesson that I would want people to also be thinking about from this whole conversation is how it is that you use your positionality, your identities to, and your power at the institution to actually effect change. I think that what Dr. Chico is doing is a really phenomenal thing in thinking about being, and I think I can say this because of the way that you refer to yourself, right? As a full professor, as a white passing Latina, somebody who is thinking in terms of there's work that needs to be done. So let me use the influence, the positionality, the power, the resources that I have in order to be able to bring a more transformative conversation to the campus and not one that's just transactional, not just a checkbox. But how do we invest ourselves in this conversation over the course of time? So I hope that people can also learn from your example and how it is that you have done that, because I think that's a really important practical piece too. Parting words to you, or last words to you, Dr. Chico.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I'm grateful for you saying that. But not the but, and I'm not alone. I am surrounded by wisdom and insight and rigor and care and a little bit of sauciness with my very valued colleagues. And so we're particularly some extremely close colleagues who mentor me all the time. And so kind of this is I'm further along than many people, many graduate students, many early career scholars, but it is that this really happens. I'm able to do this because of the community that I'm in. So I'm very grateful to that, and to everyone that I work with. I'm very, very grateful.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that people could also just take a really practical point from that. You don't do this work alone. You have to be in collaboration with other people because anti racism work is exhausting. And so you need to have some other soldiers, squad members, however you want to term your people, right? You need other people in the fight, in the battle with you. So I appreciate that as well. Thank you so much for this conversation today. I look forward to our September the 9th event as well as collaboration across the rest of the year.
Thank you very much.